Professor S.S. Murthy, Professor A.K. Chaturvedi, Professor Rangan Banerjee, and Professor Rao. A variety of topics like 5G, futuristic technology, energy, and environment, which were mostly technical. Today we are here to listen about global economy and international relations, with a focus on G20. As you all know, G20 or Group 20 is an intergovernment forum comprising 19 countries and European Union to address major issues such as international financial stability, climate change mitigation, and sustainable development. The G20 this year is more important to us because of India's presidency of the group, which began on 1st December 2022. During this presidency, RIS, that is the Research and Innovation System for Developing Countries, has organized lectures in reputed universities and institutions across India, with an objective to make the young generation aware about the global issues. MIT Jaipur is now becoming one of those institutes where the lectures have been organized. The speaker for today's lecture is His Excellency J.S. Mukul. His Excellency J.S. Mukul, Speaker of the Day, Professor Padhi, Director MIT, my faculty colleagues, staff, and dear students. A warm welcome to all of you to this lecture on G20 University Connect, Engaging Young Minds. I would request Professor Padhi, Director MIT, to please welcome the speaker, Sri J.S. Mukul, with a floral bouquet.
भारत देश है 130 करोड़ देशवासियों का, विभिन्न धर्मों के अनोखे संगम का, परंपराओं और रीति रिवाजों का। टेक्नोलॉजी के क्षेत्र में विश्व का उभरता केंद्र है भारत। दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा लोकतंत्र है भारत। दुनिया की सबसे प्राचीन सभ्यताओं में से एक, भव्य सांस्कृतिक विरासत और विविधताओं से संपन्न और विश्व की 5वीं सबसे बड़ी अर्थव्यवस्था के रूप में G20 की प्रेसिडेंसी पाकर भारत को गर्व है। आज जब हम सब एक नए युग में प्रवेश कर रहे हैं, मानवता की हर चुनौती पर विजय पाने के लिए एक प्रतीक हम सबको प्रेरित कर रहा है। कमल, भारत का राष्ट्रीय पुष्प। कमल दर्शाता है हमारी भव्य संस्कृति को, गौरवशाली इतिहास को। ये प्रतीक है आध्यात्म का, समृद्धि का, ज्ञान और प्रकाश का। यही कमल है G20 भारत 2023 के लोगो डिजाइन की प्रेरणा। इस डिजाइन में सम्मिलित केसरिया, सफेद, हरा और नीला रंग भारत के राष्ट्रीय ध्वज के रंग है। इस कमल की 7 पंखुड़ियां 7 महासागर और G20 भारत 2023 में भाग लेने वाले 7 महाद्वीपों के संगम को दर्शाती है। और इसकी पंखुड़ियों के बीच स्थापित पृथ्वी दर्शाती है जीवन के प्रति भारत की प्रो प्लैनेट विचारधारा और पूरे विश्व को अपना परिवार मानने की सोच को। इसी सोच का निष्कर्ष है G20 भारत 2023 की थीम वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, एक पृथ्वी, एक कुटुंब, एक भविष्य। इस थीम का लक्ष्य है G20 का ध्यान साझा प्रगति की ओर केंद्रित करना और ये सुनिश्चित करना कि ये प्रगति हमेशा प्रकृति के साथ हो। G20 भारत 2023, एक पृथ्वी, एक कुटुंब, एक भविष्य। वसुधैव कुटुंबकम।
Before inviting the speaker for the lecture, I would like to formally introduce him to you. In fact, I feel honored to introduce him. His Excellency J.S. Mukul joined Indian Foreign Services in 1981. Born on April 22, 1957. He is a postgraduate in political science with a specialization in international relations and has held diplomatic positions in embassies, High Commission, Permanent Mission, Consulate General of India in Damascus, Abu Dhabi, Kandy, Colombo, Geneva, Riyadh, Munich, Netherlands, and Muscat. Apart from posting at the headquarters in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, he was also the ministry's Sherpa for the G20 process and was involved with 6 G20 summits. He has had varied assignments in his diplomatic career involving both bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, covering political, disarmament and economic commercial work. So we have been listening to technocrats and professors during the last 6 lectures. Now it is chance to listen to a diplomat. So now I invite His Excellency J.S. Mukul sir to deliver his lecture and enlighten us.
Certainly it is an honor for all of us to have Ambassador Mukul with us. And he is such a senior and learned person. Almost 4 decades of experience, and we were talking for the last 12 to 14 minutes in my office. And you'll be surprised to know that we share most of common experiences. Indirectly, I am also part of G20, and he is the toss bearer of G20. So a lot of common things. And I'm very sure these young minds will. And the title, you see, G20 University Connect, engaging young minds, and probably he will also try to motivate all of us. So without taking a lot of time, Mukulji, welcome to the dais. Thank you.
Professor N.P. Padi, Honorable Director of the Madhaviya National Institute of Technology, MNIT Jaipur. Professor Murari Lal Mittal of MNIT Jaipur. Mr. Syed Ali, representative of RIS. Professors, faculty members of MNIT, and above all, my dear students, good afternoon and namaskar. At the outset, let me first begin by thanking the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, or RIS, and the Ministry of External Affairs, MEA, for inviting me to this lecture. As you are aware, Honorable Prime Minister and the Director referred to this also, the Honorable Prime Minister has mandated that as part of India's G20's presidency, 75 G20 University Connect engaging young mind lectures will be conducted. And in that context, this is my modest contribution to be here today. I would also like to thank, and I'm indeed very grateful to MNIT Jaipur for organizing and arranging this program and for all your hospitality. Thank you very much, sir. Now, I've been given about half an hour, and then we have enough time for Q&A after that. So, of course, you can always ask me in between also for any issue. My presentation today will be divided in two parts. In the first part, I will try to delineate for us, because I know you're all engineering background and the thing, so I'll delineate, try to make it simple and delineate for us G20 itself. The second part will focus on India's priorities, because that is what is important going forward and running. We are very close to the summit and we'll come to that. So let me straight away start by asking a question. What is G20? First we need to understand very clearly what is G20. Why is it so important? I mean, there are multiple regional and international intergovernmental organizations. None has the kind of thing today that the G20 has. So what is G20? It starts off in I'll just trace for you very briefly the evolution of G20 from the developed countries perspective and from the developing countries, and where they merge, and that is where we have the G20 today. It starts off in the 1970s when the leading industrial powers of the world decided to set up an informal grouping called the G7. Canada, in fact, took the initiative, but it was Canada, USA, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. And the reason for setting up this was to influence global trade, to tackle cross-cutting issues, and to address emerging global crises. That is where the G7 came. We were not very much concerned. It was a grouping of industrialized countries. In 1998, they also incorporated, after the end of the Cold War and the disappearance of the Soviet Union and Russian Federation. In 1998, they also incorporated Russia. So it became the G8. So very often you hear the term, not today because of Ukraine, but otherwise G7, G8. This business of G8 continued till 2014, after which, of course, the Russians and the West, as you know, fell apart with the Ukraine issue, the Crimean crisis and all that. So that is the G8. Even they found in 1999, particularly the Southeast Asian crisis, that this G8 was not good enough to address these issues. So they got in the developed of the developing countries, or what we call the emerging market economies, and set up the G20. But again, nobody gave much importance, because at that time it was only at the level of finance ministers and central bank governments. And the crises in 1990s, the Southeast Asian crisis, there was also a Russian issue, there was a Mexican thing, there were many financial and economic, mainly in the financial and the economic domain. 2008 is an important date, because then they realized, because of the global financial and economic crisis, or what is now called the Great Recession of 2008, that this is also not sufficient. We need at least the bigger of the developing countries or the emerging economies. And that is where this got elevated or upgraded, whatever word you want to use, the G20 to the summit level. So it became at the heads of state and government, the summit 2008, Washington summit. In the third summit in Pittsburgh, again in USA, it was anointed as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. And since then, in 2000, after the 2008 crisis started, in 2009 and 2010, there were two summits, because there was much to be done. Since 2011, it's been an annual summit. We have had 17 summits, and as was mentioned, this is India's presidency on September 8 and 9 at the new Indian, the newly inaugurated, with the Prime Minister inaugurated, the convention center, the exhibition and convention center, the old Pragati Maidan, is going to host the 18th summit under India's presidency. This is the evolution of the G20 on the developed countries. Now let me trace for you the evolution of the same from the developing countries and our perspective. Now, I can tell this audience that basically bilateral diplomacy or bilateral relations is what we call the bread and butter of diplomacy. It's really bilateral, India, USA, India, China, India, Japan. But these are supplemented and complemented by regional and global or international organizations. The developing countries had their own international organizations. Just to give an example, you would have heard of the Non-Aligned Movement and that, more on the political side. You heard of the G77. The G77 today has 132 countries, which is mainly on the economic side. These are the developing country groupings. And typically, these developing country groupings focused on very largely on two sets of issues. One was South-South cooperation, which is fairly simple. We are developing countries, we cooperate with each other. South-South cooperation, fairly straightforward. The more complicated was what will come to be known as North-South dialogue. This is trying to engage the North, the developing countries trying to engage the developed countries. That was a very big challenge. Why? Because first, sometimes we send communiques from the South, they would hardly be acknowledged. Or sometimes you got a bare acknowledgement. Sometimes there would be side events held. So it was a very unsatisfactory situation. It had mixed results. It has very limited success. Sometime in between this whole evolutionary process, the developed said we will engage with some of the developing countries, and they had chosen 5. India, China, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico. The larger of what they thought, which has come to be known as I won't get into technical, as the Heligan Dam L'Aquila process. That went on for some time. In simple terms, the G8 plus 5. So they had the G7, G8 I explained, then you had the 5. But even that, as I told you, was not sufficient, and therefore they added 7 more. 6 countries: Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Indonesia, Republic of Korea, Australia. 6 countries, plus as mentioned by Professor, European Union. So that constituted the G20. So this evolution continued. And there would be, as I said, events where there would be side events, we would be invited by them, sometimes they would engage, very unsatisfactory situation. Till 2008, thanks to the great recession, I shouldn't say that, when they got all the 20 on the high table for the first time. And the rest, as they say, is history. So for the first time from our perspective, the evolution is in 2008. Of course, G20 had come into being in 1999, but then it was only, as I said, at the finance minister's level. But in 2008, we for the first time got a place as equals on the high table. So that, I think, is the evolution, and since then, of course, the G20 has proceeded. But here one has to be very careful. They have selected a few countries, these additional from the developing. We should not forget our other colleagues in the G77, the smaller African, Asian, Latin American developing countries. It's not that, we have arrived now, we have joined the big group, so we don't care for the others. That should never happen. And please hold that thought, I'll come back to that, the global south angle. Why? So this is what is G20? Why is the G20 important? Just a few facts for you because of its sheer weight and heft. 50% or half the world's geographical area is occupied by the G20 countries. 2/3 or 67% of the global population is in the G20 countries. 3/4 or 75% of the international trade is by the G20 countries. And 85% of the GDP of the world is in these countries. That's just very simply to tell you what is the importance, why is it important. How does the G20 work? What is the working methods of the G20? As I said, initially 2 summits. Now, of course, there is an annual summit. It rotates annually. India is the present. We got, as Professor mentioned, from 30th of November 2022 till 1st of December 2023 is our presidency. Though our summit will be held on 9th and 10th of September. The There is no secretariat. You will be surprised to say that find that G20 has no secretariat. The presidency provides the secretariat with the help of a troika. The troika is nothing but the immediate past presidency and the future incoming presidency. So for India's presidency, it is Indonesia, the outgoing, for the last presidency, India, and the incoming, Brazil. And therefore, thereafter it will be South Africa, so that will complete the full circuit of 20 summits. It works under 3 tracks, broadly. The original finance minister, 1999, it started as finance minister central bank, so there is the finance track. It is under the Ministry of Finance. They have 8 working groups and things like that. We will not go into those details. Then, after it became elevated to the summit level in 2008, they appointed an institution of the Sherpa. And as was mentioned, I had the privilege of being a Sherpa, which is a deputy Sherpa. The Sherpa during my time was Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. He was the Sherpa for many summits. And now, of course, it is Mr. Okay, anyway, the present. Mr. Amitabh Kant, sorry for that. Yeah. So the Sherpa was institution only means, since there is no secretariat, you have the president or the prime minister, and he is consulted. In the summit also, it is only the Sherpa. It's not the ministers are not there with him. The Sherpa is also responsible. So then there is a Sherpa track came into it. Today it has 13 working groups. And finally, we have had engagement groups like the Y20, the U20, the T20, the trade, B20, the business 20, the W20, the women 20. So like that, there are 11 engagement groups like that. So this is the organizational structure, the way it works. Decision making in the G20. Now this is very important. Decisions in the G20 are taken by consensus. It basically means, you don't say, it basically means every member has a veto. It's not by majority. And the way it works is, it sends, as I pointed out, it is the premier forum for international economic cooperation, but at the summit level, all the decisions are political. It sends political impetus on leading finance and trade issues of the day. So, when the summit decides on the trade issue, it doesn't become implemented immediately. That impetus goes to the WTO. Because it has so much weight, it is expected in WTO it will be formalized. If it is on the finance issue, it will go to the IMF or World Bank, and there it will be the decisions are taken there. So it is really, in that sense, informal. It sends a political impetus on the main economic issues. Now coming to India's presidency. It is, we call it, since it comes after the pandemic also, because it's one of the presidencies which is important in that sense, because a couple of summits back it was held virtually and nobody heard it. Saudi Arabia, I think, was heard virtually. It is a presidency of healing, harmony and hope, and we may add peace given the fact that there is war happening in so it's healing, harmony and hope. The G20 logo is a lovely film, so I won't take time on this, you already explained it. The lotus symbolizes at one level the 7 continents of the world. At another level, it also symbolizes India's ancient culture, faith, thought. It's a symbol of hope and things like that. India's G20 presidency, I think, is also the timing is very opportune. Why do I say this? Because it comes at the beginning of what the Prime Minister has called Amrit Kal, 25 years going ahead till 1947, so it's well positioned to kind of in that sense also, well timed in that sense. And then India's presidency reflects the thought of universal brotherhood, of feeling, of oneness, symbolized by a traditional ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is also a thing which has been translated in the international and G20 context as one earth, one family, one future. This is the theme of India's. I won't take time because the film explained it much better. I can't improve on that. The last point of this first part of the G20 is, it's a unique feature of India's presidency, is the fact, in fact there are 2 features here which I'll mention. One is the fact that the presidency has used this opportunity to spread the message of Incredible India. You all know, and you have seen the boards and posters all over the cities in India, that by the time we finish our presidency, it would have 200 meetings, over 200 meetings would have been held in more than 50 cities, all across all states and union territories. Now, the idea is to use this to showcase India as the mother of democracy in all its glory, in all its variety, in all its diversity. That is at one level. At another level, also showcase our very rich culture, cuisine, couture, and all the rest of it. Lately, even Bollywood has been, there's the G20 Bollywood happening, a festival of film and things like that. So, short point is, in that sense, it's already been a great success that we would have showcased Incredible India to the larger world during our presidency. The second aspect of this is that we would have showcased G20 and brought it close to the people. The message of G20 through the engagement groups, through events like University Connect, has spread to all corners of India. All sections of the Indian society, all corners of India, people have been sensitized to what is G20, because this is going to be the main forum going forward. And this is already again a success story and a big achievement. So that is the first part of my presentation, all about G20, but if you have questions at the end, I'll be very happy to answer any of those. I quickly turn to the second part of my presentation, the priorities of India. Now, let me start by saying that the G20 has come to acquire a kind of Christmas tree approach. What do I mean by Christmas tree approach? Basically, what has happened in the past 17 summits, many issues, they are all there. It's not that, presidency changes, everything is previous is thrown out. They have acquired a life of their own, a momentum of their own, so all of them go forward. In addition to that, the host country has the prerogative of putting forward its priorities. And those are the ones I will sort of focus on very briefly. Now, we left off the evolution at the global south issue point. Now, as preparatory to our presidency, I think we did very well to host what is called a summit of the global south. Prime Minister Modi, I think, had 120 or 125 heads of state government and others in a virtual summit, which was held preparatory. The idea was to, before we actually formally launched our priorities, to get the sense of the global south, the spirit of the global south, and to put them as part of our priorities. Therefore, this is actually one of the priorities. It's a cross-cutting priority. It kind of cuts across all the other priorities, the specific priorities that I will be mentioning for you. Now, I will, for the sake of time, I've just kept 6 priorities. There are many, you can of course have different ways of looking at it. The first one is on the specific priorities: green development, climate finance, lifestyle for environment, or what is called life. Now, we all know we have a climate crisis on our hands. The world knows it. It is the foremost challenge today, is this climate change. Developing countries of the global south require, both for adaptation and for mitigation, resources, technological and financial, from the developed world. And therefore, climate change will focus on climate financing. By example, the developed countries have promised $100 billion per year since 2020 through to 2025. It is another matter that they have never fulfilled their commitment in any year, including, we are hoping that for the first time in 2023 this may happen. So that is something that is a priority which will be ensured, which will be emphasized, and we are trying to ensure that just energy transitions for developing countries, or what is come to be known as climate justice. And the director was present he's been in this field for a long time, including with the Paris Agreement, etc., where climate justice has much talk has happened. Lifestyle for environment or life means focusing on environmentally sustainable and responsible choices, both or at responsible choices at the individual, national and global level for a cleaner, greener and bluer future for all of us. And the last point on this is create and nurture a global network of individuals, what is called the pro-planet people or the P3 concept. So this is the first major priority of India: green development, climate finance, lifestyle for environment. Moving on to the second one, and this you people know better than I do, the technological transformation or the digital public infrastructure. Now, as we all know, India's IT prowess, I don't need to tell this audience on India's IT prowess and the progress that we have made. India's achievements in digital transformation, the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, Mobile, the India Stack, and the way we use it for the direct benefit transfers and things like that. Also during the pandemic, the CoWIN app, it's an amazing statistic. The CoWIN app was used to give 2 billion vaccine shots were administered. It looks in hindsight that it's a routine thing, but it's 2 billion in an orderly and organized manner to the CoWIN app. And as they say, I'm very fond of this, never allow a crisis to go waste. We all work from home. Work from home has become also a impetus for digital, provided momentum, for digital momentum, etc. Then there are so many UPI platforms. Again, you people know this better, how you do this, the Paytms and all the other apps that are being used. I'll just point to you a recent CNN report which says India's consumption of data is more than USA and China combined. So that is the kind of digital transformation or technological transformation that we have. I move on to the third Indian priority for the G20 presidency: accelerated, inclusive and resilient growth as a cornerstone of sustainable development. Now, we all know Prime Minister's Gati Shakti plan for infrastructure development, etc., accelerating the growth of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, to achieve the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Now, here again, the developed countries have committed as part of Monterrey commitment, etc., to give 0.7% of their GDP as ODA, official development assistance to the developing countries. It is again very sad that no developed country has fulfilled this commitment. The idea is to make them and see how they can deliver on their commitments, because these are important for the developing countries of the global south. The fourth priority of India's presidency is food security and energy security. Now we know that there are many crises sweeping the world today. You are living in an energy or fuel crisis, there is a fertilizer crisis, there is a food crisis, there is a debt crisis. We already had referred to the climate crisis. And it appears that nobody is listening to the developing countries who are facing these crises. G20 is ideally positioned to address this, as it impacts the food crisis, the fertilizer crisis, the debt crisis, the energy crisis, impacts the developing countries in the global south. Therefore, again, it's a priority of India's G20 presidency. The fifth one, women or gender equality. Now, as the Honorable Prime Minister says, and I quote, "From financial inclusion to social security, quality healthcare to housing, education to entrepreneurship, many efforts have been made to put our Nari Shakti at the forefront of India's development journey," unquote. SDG 5 is incidentally also referring to gender equality and women empowerment. And we in the country have many schemes. You all know about them: the Ujjwala scheme, the Nirbhaya scheme, the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao scheme, the Sukanya Samriddhi, the disbursements in the Mudra, etc. The challenge for the G20 is to mainstream gender equality and women empowerment, which is again, it becomes a kind of cross-cutting priority. And I must say in this context that the G20 Development Working Group recommendations which were endorsed at the recent G20 Development Ministers meeting which happened in Varanasi a few weeks ago has come out with very far-reaching and impressive recommendations in this regard. That is the fifth priority of the Indian presidency. And the last but not the least, the sixth one I'll mention is multilateralism. Now, multilateral institutions that we have them as we have them today were all crafted after the Second World War in the 1940s and the 1950s. The UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, and all the rest of it. Sadly, what has happened, India incidentally is a big supporter of multilateralism. But what has sadly happened is that many of these crafted in that era do not reflect ground realities today. They are therefore crying out for urgent reforms in order to remain relevant. And I'll give you examples. The UN has proved to be ineffective in the Ukraine crisis. Its main mandate is to maintain peace, etc. The Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, need quota and voting reforms very badly. The WTO, World Trade Organization, is almost paralyzed and dysfunctional in many ways. We saw during the pandemic the WHO, World Health Organization, came up short in many areas. Therefore, today India and the developing countries, we stand for what is called reformed multilateralism. Reformed multilateralism is the need of the hour, the demand of the global south, and therefore a priority of India's G20 presidency. Those are the 6 specific priorities of India. Of course, the global south sort of permeates them. Now, apart from this, let me also mention that apart from these specific priorities that I have outlined, the global situation is dynamic. You can't at the beginning of the year say these are the priorities which have come up. Now we can recall that the G20 came of age, as I said, addressing in 1999 and that time the crisis that happened, and of course mainly in 2008 the global financial economic crisis or the Great Recession. That is where it earned its spurs. Now, earlier this year, during India's presidency, we saw there was again renewed banking turbulence or what we call financial rumblings on both sides of the Atlantic. You must have also read, if you're reading the newspaper, some banks collapsing and all this. The point is that India's G20 presidency is well positioned to address these issues and try to nip these crises in the bud before they become full-blown financial or banking or economic crises. So those are the priorities, and that is the second part of my presentation. In conclusion, therefore, let us say that India's G20 president, one thing I must say, we compliment our leadership for first giving us or articulating an inclusive G20 agenda for the requirements or the priorities of the global south. But the challenge is to translate these priorities into consensus decisions of the G20. Now this is obviously easier said than done. This remains work in progress, and it will go, given that if I go by my experience of 6 G20 summits, the first in the initial periods, this will be decided at the midnight of between 9th and 10th of September. The negotiations go on till late or early hours of the morning. So that remains work in progress, and it will be decided. Some of our priorities we should be ready. I hope not. Some of our priorities where we should be ready may get slightly diluted, because as we know the G20 works on the basis of consensus, and it's a kind of lowest common denominator prevails there. But even so, I think we are today assured that overall we have a very rich menu of achievements for even before the summit. We can say a very rich menu of achievements awaits us when these are announced on the 10th or September or whatever. And to recall our Prime Minister's thing, I think it resonates throughout these priorities when he said that India's priorities will be inclusive, they will be decisive, they will be action-oriented. So that I think is broadly that is going to be achieved. Now, there are another challenge. This is the challenge of geopolitics. There is the issue of Ukraine, today agitating a large part of the membership of the G20. Now, this has the potential to divert or distract or even derail the G20 process. But I think, as our Prime Minister, as our External Affairs Minister has said, and I quote, "Let G20 be G20. It should stay there, refocus there," unquote. Basically, what he's trying to say is the G20 should remain and focus as a premier international forum on international economic cooperation, not try to address all problems of the world. It will naturally, it's not possible. Now, India has, of course, some advantages in this. It brings a lot of value to the table, given our background of non-alignment, of multi-alignment, of all alignment, and our strategic autonomy, a lot of which is being heard of today also. India can talk to everyone, India can work with almost everyone, and due to India's standing, stature, credibility, capabilities, it can play a bridging role in building this consensus. In fact, a kind of a catalytic role in bringing everybody on board to achieve this consensus which we are striving for in the summit. But let me make one point very clear. While we are trying our best, and I'm sure other members of the G20 are also trying our best, ultimately consensus requires agreement of all. I pointed out it works, G20 works on the basis of consensus. Any country can veto anything. So really all the members have to own up as stakeholders, take responsibility. It's not only India's responsibility. Yes, we are the presidency, we are trying, facilitating, etc. But it is actually the responsibility of every member country to ensure that we are able to reach a good, as our Prime Minister said, an inclusive, decisive, and an action-oriented result. So, a lot of hope of the G20, a lot of hope of the global South, and in fact, a lot of hope of the world at large rides on India's G20 presidency. I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention. Ask any question, G20 or even otherwise on foreign international relations, foreign policy. Of course, with the caveat that I may not have all the answers, but you are free to nevertheless ask all the questions. Yeah, please.
Sir, I am Aditya Rawat from Mechanical Engineering, 4th year, and I wanted to ask that a lot of the modern technological developments like automation, they are going to improve output, but at the same time they are leading to job losses. And the improved output is very beneficial for developed countries like the global north, who have very skilled populations and relatively lower populations. But for countries of the global south, which have larger populations, which are less skilled on average, so this is a concern. So how can India, as the president of the G20, help to ensure that the benefits from automation and artificial intelligence are more equitably distributed among the countries of the world? Very good.
Thank you. I think your professors can answer that much better than mine, me, because this is a question on artificial intelligence. But let me, from a general, from a layman's perspective, mention, I think this is the same debate when I was a student like you when computers came in. Same doubts were raised at that time. The computers are going to take away jobs, the computers are going to help X, Y, not this. But really, many of those fears, as we know today, have been misplaced, found to be misplaced. I hope that the same would apply to I don't know much about artificial intelligence, but much the same would apply. But the second part of it that you say, yes, that is something that we are trying to ensure through just the existence of the G20, that whatever benefits are there, we pointed out in the climate change mitigation, they should provide technology, they should provide, the developed countries should provide as per the commitment financial resources under their ODA thing also 0.7% they should provide. So yes, you are absolutely right. I mean, these cannot be monopolized by any one or two countries. But I think today the environment is such, I don't think we have that risk. And it's, again, as I pointed out, it's also the developed of the developing countries or so-called emerging market economies which are there in the G20. That they should also sort of spread it to those developing countries which may not have sort of kept pace. Yeah.
So my question is, we often talk about GDP, but we fail to talk about GDP per capita. Google shows that Sri Lanka has twice as GDP per capita of India. Ukraine, even after facing such huge war, has 1.5 times more GDP per capita than India. So what are your views about it?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, nobody is denying the fact that we still have 250 million people below the poverty line and things. The government, there was a recent program I was listening on by a colleague of mine, which says that the government is, since the pandemic, is feeding 800 million people, still feeding, which started, which may also indicate that all of them may not be below the poverty line, and obviously they are on the fringes. So I think nobody is denying that fact. But then the point is, I mean, these are different development models, and that is why we talk of the sustainable development today. We talk of the point that we reach a level that India is today the fifth largest economy. We are aiming to be, and obviously this leads to a large number of people. I think the record, if you look at it from the other side, in the last 10 or 15 years, the number of people which we have lifted out of poverty is really very creditable. But that's not to forget those which are still below the poverty line. You're absolutely right. They need to be addressed, and I think that is at no level that is lost sight of in India. There are no other questions. I'll just make one more point before I close, which I should have. One major achievement of the G20, which is actually going to happen, is because G20, as I showed you, the structure is broadly balanced between the developed and the developing or emerging. But there is one lacuna there. I thought somebody will ask, but since you have not asked, I'll mention it. It has very poor representation of Africa. In the G20, there is only South Africa. And therefore, just to say, while there are G20 and 20 countries, in addition to that, Spain is a permanent invitee, so that makes it 20 plus 21. There are going to be 11 international organizations which are there permanently. The United Nations, World Bank, IMF, WTO, WHO, ILO, OECD, Financial Stability Forum, AU, ODA, Nepal, and ASEAN. So 11 more are there. So that makes it 32. In addition to these 32, India as a host has invited 11 more. So 32 plus these 11 will make 43. So though we talk of G20, there are actually going to be 43 leaders present when this meeting happens. And what are these 11 which India has invited? 3 organizations, the ISA, International Solar Alliance, the CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resistance Infrastructure, and the Asian Development Bank. So those are the multilateral. The countries which we have invited is very interesting. We have invited, out of those countries that we have invited, and just give me a minute, Bangladesh, Egypt, Mauritius, Netherlands, Nigeria, Oman, Singapore, and UAE. Now, out of these 8 countries, which are special guests of ours and will be present at the summit, their heads of state and government, 3 are African countries: Egypt, Mauritius, and Nigeria. The idea is, so they have South Africa there, you have 2 international organizations, African Union and Nepal. So they will be represented by Comoros and Rwanda respectively. So they will have 3 there, plus our 3. So there will be 6 African leaders out of these 43. The idea is to redress this balance. But more importantly, this will happen only for the G20 presidency of India. But more importantly, to address this thing in a permanent basis, Prime Minister has proposed and has written to all the members that we should get the African Union as the 21st member of the G20. Now, given the emerging consensus, global emerging consensus on this, I think this is kind of a low-hanging fruit which we will achieve in the summit, and in a manner it may become the biggest achievement of the G20 summit in New Delhi, because one, it will be the first time that the G20 since 1999 will be formally expanded. You will have a 21st member. It may not mean much substantially in substantial terms, because AU as African Union is always present there as a permanent invitee, but not as a member. They've been a permanent invitee or guest, but they will now become a member. It appears to be. I may be wrong, of course, but it appears they will become, and this will be a major takeaway or achievement of this summit. It is also optically very good for us, because it will come under India's presidency, it will come in the Delhi summit. It also resonates well with our theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one family, one future, one earth, one family, one future, and it sort of gels in very well with our priority of the global south. So I thought I'd just mention this, that African Union may become, at the Delhi summit, the 21st member of the G20. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such an enlightening and insightful lecture. I'm sure the audience are greatly benefited by having a perspective of global economy with special reference to G20. I now request Director sir to please present the memento to the guest, Sri Mukul. Before that, I would like to present a vote of thanks. This event will be incomplete without formal thanks to all those who have contributed towards its success, and I feel privileged to propose a vote of thanks. First, I would like to thank His Excellency J.S. Mukul for sparing valuable time from his busy schedule for such an enlightening lecture. We are thankful to RIS, a nodal agency for organizing such lectures under G20, who has given the opportunity to organize and financing the lecture. My sincere thanks are due to Professor Padi for extending moral and administrative support for the lecture. A lecture is not a lecture without the audience. So I sincerely thank the faculty and students for their presence in the lecture and patient listening. We are almost handicapped in organizing such activities without student volunteers, and this vote of thanks would be incomplete without thanking them. I would just like to thank some of the students, Jitesh, Rakesh, Roshan and Akanksha, who have worked hard to make this event a success. Thank you all again. Now, I request all of you to please stand up for national anthem.
अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य गुजरात मराठा